In this video we are taking another look at the kill teams of the Deathwatch and how to make best use of their mixed units. In this first part of a double episode, we will look at the three Primaris Kill Teams, namely the Spectrus, the Fortis and the Indomitor Kill Team. In the second part, released at a later time, we will then look at the Proteus Kill Team and its multitude of combinations. To round this episode up, there will be some modeling recommendations and a quick wrap-up.
Welcome to SwissHammer, your channel for modeling in Warhammer 40k. My name is Tamer and I will be guiding you through this video.
In my previously released guides on each of the Deathwatch Kill Teams, I primarily focused on how they are built and what kind of combinations are possible. My main goal was to provide some sort of instruction manual, as the information is spread across the Deathwatch supplement, the Space Marine Codex, and even FAQs for both. The links to the guides are in the description. For the purposes of this video, I am going to assume that you are already familiar with the basics of building these kill teams, and will instead focus on what kind of mixed units and weapon loadouts work particularly well at this point in 9th edition. Special thanks to two viewers, Realmweaver Gaming and the name I cannot pronounce, for submitting suggestions about this particular topic. We will start with the sneaky one, the Spectrus Kill Team. One of the big advantages of the Spectrus Kill Team is that we can go above the limit of 3 Eliminators in a squad. Eliminators did receive a nerf in 9th edition and have dropped a bit out of fashion in other Space Marine armies, but I personally think that bringing 1 or 2 extra in a Spectrus Kill Team can somewhat compensate for that. One variant I have seen is keeping the Spectrus Kill Team at 5 Infiltrators and 5 Eliminators, forcing your opponent to chew through 5 Infiltrators and Smokescreen before they can touch the Eliminators. Personally, I don't necessarily like this approach, because I think that it creates yet another expensive kill team blob, which then results in lack of board control. Instead, I personally favor the approach of using Combat Squad with the Spectrus Kill Team in order to maximize having at least 1 Infiltrator in each Combat Squad, and therefore maximizing its Deep Strike Denial bubble. One of the big advantages of the Spectrus Kill Team is that 1 Infiltrator is enough to give it to the unit. There are 2 variants of this approach that I believe work particularly well. The first is using 1 Infiltrator with Helix Gauntlet and 4 Eliminators in 1 combat squad. This basically boosts the Eliminators' damage output by having 4 instead of just 3, adds to their survivability thanks to the Helix Gauntlet and access to Smokescreen, and also keeps omni-scramblers active on this combat squad. Either loadout on the Eliminators is viable, depending on the rest of your list, though I recommend not mixing their weapons, even though you technically could. The other combat squad will then consist out of the remaining 4 mandatory Infiltrators, 3 plus the Sergeant to be precise, and whatever else you want to fill up with. There are a variety of options here. Another Infiltrator might seem obvious at first, though you can get away cheaper by adding a plain Incursor or even a Reaver, though the latter will prevent the combat squad to be set up with concealed positions. Another variant which I personally use is the Incursor with the Haywire Mine. If you set up with concealed positions, this can discourage cheap charge attempts. Speaking of cheap, I have briefly mentioned Reivers. While they generally lack synergy within a Spectrus Kill Team, no concealed positions and no access to their Terror Troop stratagem, they are the cheapest way to fill up a Spectrus Kill Team. A Spectrus Kill Team consisting out of 5 Infiltrators and 5 Reivers only costs 210 points, a full 30 points less than filling up with Infiltrators. If you split the combat squad's 3 Infiltrators, 2 Reivers and 2 Infiltrators, 3 Reivers. The Reivers act as cheaper ablative wounds for the Infiltrators, providing the omni-scramblers. While you cannot deploy with concealed positions anymore, you can pretty much screen out your entire deployment zone. This approach has found its way into various competitive lists and tournament play. While there is no points difference between the 2 weapon loadouts of the Reivers, the bolt carbines are recommended to match the range of the Infiltrators, and you don't want these squads to go close combat anyway. Moving on to the Fortis Kill Team. Immensely popular at the early stages of the supplement release, the 5 Intercessors and 5 Outrider has taken a bit of a dent due to Outriders going up in points and losing the Infantry keyword when not mixed with Infantry. While 5 Outriders can still be done, especially on maps with low terrain, a more commonly seen approach as of late is doing 6 Intercessors and 4 Outriders, then combat squadding the Outriders with the Intercessor Sergeant. He has the free chainsword after all. On maps with good amount of terrain, the ability to keep the Infantry keyword still outperforms the loss of the bike's movement. Another overlooked combo, and I'm very much guilty of that myself, are Hellblasters. In 9th edition, Plasma Inceptors got all the hype, yet Hellblasters have also seen quite some improvements thanks to their 3 weapon types. What particularly stands out here is the assault version through sheer volume of shots. When adding Hellblasters to the Fortis Kill Team, there are a couple of considerations to be made. The Kill Team can be kept intact and the Intercessors acting as ablative wounds, or the Hellblasters can be split in a separate combat squad. This is fairly common. However, another point I want to stress here is emulating firstborn tactical squads. What I mean by this is basically having regular bolter marines with a heavy or special weapon mixed in. If you played older editions, this was the norm due to the lack of many more recent additions to the codex. One way to do this is splitting 3 Intercessors, 2 Hellblasters and 2 Intercessors, 3 Hellblasters, or even only taking 4 Hellblasters and splitting 2 times 3-2. This creates combat squads with plasma weapons and ablative intercessor wounds, not dissimilar to how tactical squads work. Targeting a combat squad of 5 Hellblasters is likely a priority for your opponent, but will they bother with 2 Hellblasters hiding behind 3 Intercessors? Especially when going for lists with a lot of bodies, this is a viable alternative. Just like with the Hellblasters, the general recommendation is to run the Intercessors with the auto bolt rifle, especially when you mix the 2. However, if you are going to just leave the 5 Intercessors on their own, for instance to guard the home objective, then the Stalker bolt rifle could be a viable alternative. Which brings me to the last point. Last and not directly related to the Fortis Kill Team, I want to mention Intercessors and the rapid fire stratagem. A commonly seen tactic is using a full squad of Intercessors with Stalker bolt rifles, then combining the stratagem's rapid fire and special issue loadout for one hell of a bullet storm. The Stalker bolt rifles are ideal for this because they are already heavy 1 and therefore synergize well with the special issue loadout stratagem, which will turn the weapon type to heavy 1 anyway. While a bit CP heavy, this strategy is perfectly viable, but it has to be done with an actual Intercessor squad. Do not use a Fortis Kill Team for this, as they don't get the Intercessor's keyword and therefore cannot access the rapid fire stratagem. With the Fortis Kill Team covered, let's have a look at our chunky boys, the Indomitor Kill Team. Originally, this kill team got a lot of hype for the potential of ObSec Eradicator spam. Meanwhile though, I think we have figured out a few more combinations on top of that. In general, I recommend equipping the default 5 heavy intercessors with the Hellstorm bolt rifle. That's the assault variant. As with the loadouts on the Fortis Kill Team, it boils down to volume of shots. In addition to the heavy intercessors, adding 5 of any of the other models, aggressors, eradicators or inceptors is a viable way to run an Indomitor Kill Team. Especially the 5 plasma inceptors have been commonly seen in a variety of competitive lists. Also, a single Inceptor is enough to give the whole kill team access to the fallback and shoot strategy. One thing to keep in mind though is that when adding Eradicators, their total obliteration ability requires the whole kill team to target the same unit. This means in most cases that the heavy intercessors will end up targeting something that's not ideal for their weapons. The alternative is of course to split the two by combat squads, but then the Eradicators lose the extra protection from the heavy intercessors. So far so good. That's the basics of the Indomitor Kill Team. There are two variants in particular though that stood out to me as of late. The first is running 5 heavy intercessors and 5 eradicators, then using combat squads as following: 3 heavy intercessors and 2 eradicators, 2 heavy intercessors and 3 eradicators. I had originally mentioned this in my guide to the Indomitor Kill Team, and surprisingly enough have seen it resurface in a recent interview with Jason Sniegowski. He scored an amazing rank 6 with Deathwatch at the recent Motor City Mayhem tournament. His reasoning for doing combat squads like this were as following: depending on the matchup, 5 eradicators are overkill. For a long time in 9th edition, vehicles have been somewhat absent for many lists, so having 2 to 3 eradicators is already enough to deal with some elite infantry and the likes. There might even be matchups where the weapon profile of the heavy intercessors is preferable to that of the eradicators. Mixing the two into combat squads allows to use the ablative wounds of whichever model is the least useful one. That may sound counterintuitive at first, like using the more expensive eradicators to shield the cheaper heavy intercessors, but if you think it through, it actually makes a lot of sense. While points are of course one factor, it doesn't necessarily imply how useful a specific unit is in a specific matchup. The great part about mixed units and combat squads is of course that you can decide before each matchup how exactly you want to go about splitting them, if at all. Link to the full interview is in the description. Another great example of making full use of mixed units in an Indomitor Kill Team is the one featured in Deathwatch SH's list, which got featured on Goonhammer when they were talking about Deathwatch's apparent low tier ranking. Basically, the Indomitor Kill Team looks like this: 2 to 3 Flamestorm aggressors, 2 to 3 plasma inceptors, 5 heavy intercessors. Depending on the rest of your list, you pick either more aggressors or more plasma inceptors. This kind of kill team has a lot of firepower and can also deal with close combat threats thanks to the Flamestorm aggressors. On this kind of kill team, it makes a lot of sense to also use a specialism. Furthermore, if you protected with the Dominus Aegis relic and fortified with contempt from the Deathwatch Librarian powers, it becomes a complete nightmare to shift, excellent for holding the midboard. Link to the article is in the description. All in all, there is a lot of good stuff to be done with the Primaris Kill Teams. Last but not least, let's have a look at some modeling recommendations. For the Spectrus Kill Team, I recommend magnetizing both the Eliminators as well as the Reivers, as both of their loadouts are viable. For the Eliminators, I have a full guide linked in the description. Magnetizing the Reivers is pretty straightforward and basically the same approach as Deathwatch veterans. For the Fortis Kill Team, there is the extra challenge of the Intercessors and the Hellblasters having 3 different weapon types that only slightly differ in appearance. While it is technically possible to magnetize the magazines and everything, it's a huge hassle and most likely not worth it. What I would recommend is building them as the assault version, which currently works best in 9th edition. But even if you were to run them as something else in a competitive setting, I think if all the guns look the same and you clearly say before the match which version it is, the opponent won't mind. If it's not a Space Marine player, they likely cannot tell them apart anyway. Hell, I confuse them frequently enough myself. For the Indomitor Kill Team, I have released guides on how to magnetize all of the 4 different models. Especially for aggressors and inceptors, I recommend doing so, as both their loadouts are viable. For the heavy intercessors and eradicators, it is not necessarily required. I do however still recommend doing it for the following reason. Once you remove their guns, the Gravis model themselves are actually the exact same. This means if you use magnets, you can use one as the other. Both the heavy intercessors as well as the eradicators contain more guns than bodies. Links to the guides are in the description. To wrap things up, over the course of the video, we have looked at how to make best use of mixed units in the Primaris Kill Teams and which loadouts are currently the most viable ones. For the Spectrus Kill Team, the highlights are making use of the Infiltrators omni-scramblers, getting more than 3 Eliminators, or maximizing points costs by filling up with cheap Reivers. Then for the Fortis Kill Team, the highlights are letting the Outriders keep the Infantry keyword by combat squadding them with the Intercessor Sergeant, or to emulate the old tactical Marines by mixing Hellblasters and Intercessors. For both Intercessors and Hellblasters, using the assault weapon type is generally preferable. One thing to keep in mind though is that if you want to use the rapid fire stratagem, you have to run the Intercessors as an actual Intercessor squad. The Fortis Kill Team does not get the required keyword. For the Indomitor Kill Team, all of the units are actually viable. Besides running a classic 5-5 split, there have been 2 things that caught my attention lately. The first is 5 heavy intercessors and 5 eradicators, then using mixed combat squads. Whichever of the 2 is least useful in any given matchup gets used as ablative wounds for the other. This can sometimes mean that the eradicators get removed before the heavy intercessors. The second one is making full use of mixed units by combining Flamestorm aggressors, plasma Inceptors and the heavy intercessors into an Indomitor Kill Team that can deal with pretty much any threat when supported by a captain and a librarian. Excellent for holding the midboard with. Last but not least, magnetizing the large majority of models can go a long way for being able to run the different loadouts. Fortunately for Deathwatch, all of the Primaris Kill Teams are competitive and each of them has several viable loadouts. So that's it for the Primaris Kill Teams in the Deathwatch. Which ones are your favorite and what kind of combinations have you used so far? Have I forgotten anything important? Let me know in the comments. Finally, I would also like to mention that there is a SwissHammer Facebook page where I will be posting links to my videos as well as articles I find of interest. I do read a lot about the hobby, but not all of it will always end up as its own video. I look forward to seeing you there as well. I do also have a Patreon page. If you like my content, any additional support is greatly appreciated as it helps me invest into future videos. As always, thank you very much for watching, guys. Your continued support is greatly appreciated. I hope you have been enjoying this video. Give me a thumbs up if you did, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't done so already. Thanks again and see you next time.